This is Basket Case Clubs, CPR Group's podcast where we turn basket case clubs into showcase clubs. G'day everyone, and welcome back to Basket Case Clubs, the podcast where we love talking about basket cases. Every now and again we get to talk about some showcases, but we probably spend more time talking about basket cases because that's exactly what happens to our clubs and organisations of all shapes and sizes in Australia. Joining me as usual is Steve Connolly. G'day Steve, how you travelling?
Bloody great. Pleasure as always to be here, yabbering on about basket case clubs and
yabbering. What Australian word that is.
We've got a Canadian friend, and for the soon after she moved here and got married to my good mate, I would often be having a conversation with her or with a group of people, and I'd say something or someone would say something. She said, "What does that mean?" And it happened for the first time in a couple of years only last week when I said, "Oh yeah, so and so had a prang," and she said, "What the bloody hell is a prang?"
Hey, if she really said, "What the bloody hell is a prang?"
She's been here for a while.
Good Canadian accent there.
Having a yabber about a prang.
So here's a question: is gravy train an Australian idiom or Australian slang, do you reckon? Or does I tell you what, you can Google that while I introduce what we're going to be talking about for this little episode. Everyone who has listened to Basket Case Clubs at all over the last year and a bit knows that we really do focus on trying to build better businesses out of our clubs. The thing is that a lot of them just get to ride the gravy train. Council or the state or some form of lessee or the prime tenant if we're the subtenant, they create an environment in a lot of cases that is unrealistic. And then these organizations just use that unrealistic basis as then their new reality. So to provide a little more parameters around that, what I mean is that let's just say that council charges peppercorn rent. So what that means is that there's got to be some valuable contribution for the fact that this land is worth something. So that's why they charge rent. But peppercorn rent means it might say something in the lease like your annual fees will be $1 if collected. So there's still a financial transaction to justify the value of the lease. But then because they're getting their land for nothing, they often value it at nothing. And so they set their fees and they set their prices, and they even think about when they're doing a building development, say they're building a clubhouse, they say, well, this is a $1 million clubhouse build. Well, hang on a minute. No, it's not, because that just completely discounts the fact that land is tying up extremely valuable real estate, and that they just completely forget about the fact that the land itself has a very high value, and often the money only goes so far because of the value of that land to the broader community as well. So what we want to touch on is the fact that any organisation that is on a good wicket from council, by all means, ride that gravy train, but just be prepared for the fact that at some point that gravy train may pull into the station and you've got to get off. So you've got to have a sustainable business sitting behind it for if and when that happens.
Gravy train is an American term dating back to the early 1900s. It's an idiom with its roots sometime around the turn of the 20th century. A gravy train is a job or other source of income that generates abundant money with little effort. One may be said to be riding the gravy train in such a situation.
There we go.
So not Australian, American, according to grammarist.com.
Okay, so maybe we should have done all of that in an American accent.
But
it's going to turn out sounding Pakistani/Irish if I do an accent.
I did see, there was... it looks like some Irish ditty talking about a gravy train as well. Funny you say Irish. Anyway, okay. It does have the word bitch in it, and it says, no, it's not Irish. So the problem, as I see it, in a lot of cases with clubs to which I'm exposed, is that the longer this situation goes on, the more entrenched that mindset of dependence upon the gravy train becomes, and the harder it therefore is to break that mold.
Yeah, and look, there's some layers to this. So let me introduce a story that just really pisses me off every time I think about it. So Steve, I'll apologise to you and to all of our gracious listeners if I get a little bit worked up or get up. I'll be standing on my pulpit and beating the fire in the brimstone. So there's a rugby league club just down the road from where I live, and it had its building condemned. Now, its building was condemned because the rugby league club for 30 years neglected to maintain the building. If we go back in time, it was probably built in the 70s or 80s. It was that sort of age. It probably was done on a lot of handshake deals and a lot of love jobs and a lot of volunteer work, and maybe not necessarily to a standard that it should have been to be public infrastructure. So that building was condemned. Now, I remember reading the paper and seeing a picture of a kid with a lovely little boy with his foot on a deflated football and a deflated look on his face. And you're just supposed to get that deflated feeling in your heart of how these poor guys have been so hard done by, and putting the blame on the government and council. And I think that that is just abhorrent. Like the fault here clearly lay with committee after committee after committee who just neglected to do their maintenance on that clubhouse and neglected to take accountability for the fact that if they wanted a better life, they needed to do something about it. And okay, we can get elected and we can say, well, everyone up until this point hasn't done anything about it. That does not absolve you from your accountability to be a good committee member and say, at some point, somebody's going to have to do something about this. Why not make it us? Why don't we be that generation that breaks this cycle of shitfulness and says, let's actually start to build a business that is sustainable, that properly values what we've been given for nothing or next to nothing. And even the clubs who do have to pay a lot, like clubs who have to pay for their own water, heaven forbid, to irrigate the fields. This is a very valuable resource. And some clubs are paying tens of thousands of dollars. So for a club, an AFL club or a football club or a cricket club with large tracts of land that needs to be green, it's not uncommon for them to be spending $40,000, $50,000, $60,000 a year in water. Okay, if that's the case, that's your business model, and you've got to run a sustainable business around that model. Then a problem arises when you go over the border. Now, borders are only lines drawn on maps. When I move from one council area to another, the fact that I've changed doesn't. The air is still the same. The grass, the seed blows over from one side of the border to the other. So it's just, everything is the same, except the systems. And so the systems in this case for who's responsible for what. So on one side of the border, a club may have to pay $50,000 or $60,000 a year, and on the other side of the border, maybe they don't. Maybe council gives them that for free. Now, the clubs who are paying $50,000 or $60,000 spend their time bitching and moaning. Surprise, bitching and moaning about the fact that the guys on the other side of the fence, they don't. Okay, so who's in the right, who's in the wrong? And if the guys on the other side of the fence then set their fees as if they don't have to pay for water, they're riding the gravy train. The guys who have to charge more, this is a user-pay society that we live in, because I don't think it's okay that people who hate, in this case, rugby league, should have their rates money going to pay for kids to play rugby league. I think that councils have a community service obligation, 100%. Councils should support clubs to run sport because they should be able to provide it. But it shouldn't fall to people, it shouldn't fall to everybody to pay everything. Those clubs have an ability, and especially in sport, because sport is cool, we have an ability to charge fees because there is an intrinsic value to sport. It's part of the fabric of our culture. We are built on sport. And so it's okay to charge for it appropriately, especially given that we're, like you have often said, we're not trying to make profit for the sake of having profit in the bank. We're trying to run a sustainable business. So we can do that. We can charge enough and then be able to pay our own water. The clubs on the other side of the fence, okay, if council's paying for their water, why don't we still run a sustainable business as if we were paying for water? Because and this is the council area where I live, is one of those councils that has very generous fees and charges. That club could have taken that money that they made in those fees that they weren't paying in water and contributed to a sinking fund for 30 years. And then when that clubhouse building that was condemned because of, look, they're not all idiots, but I'm just going to generalize and call them all idiots. If they were all idiots and nobody did anything about it for that long, then guess who paid for the replacement clubhouse, Steve? Me, in my rates, because council funded half of it. Oh, guess who funded the other half? me through my state taxes because the state funded the other half. And I'm just going, come on, guys. Like, seriously, you say in the leases and you say in your leasing policy and you're saying grant policies, if we give you this if we give you money for this building, if we give you this money for this field, we're not going to pay to replace it. You have to prove to us that you have systems in place that are saving enough money so that when this asset reaches its end of useful life, you can replace it. And guess what? They'll go, yeah, we'll do that. We'll do that. And they put these beautiful looking business cases that are nothing more than a tissue of lies that just full of crap, like toilet paper, really just full of crap. Because then nobody does anything about it. They go, oh, great, we got that grant. Let's put our fees down. Really?
Hey, and that thinking goes all the way to the top in some instances. You know, Chris Kenwood, one of our consultants, is working with a national sporting organisation at the moment, and they had the financial windfall was that they were going to stop distributing a hard copy newsletter to all of their members across the country.
Yep.
So they thought, great, that's a saving of, worked it out at $18 per member. So we're going to drop our annual membership fee by $18 a member. And he'd worked out that in the few years since making that decision, they'd foregone $600,000. So that while that's not a facility related issue, that is a financial issue, and financial and facility management, as we often say, are interwoven.
So this club, the rugby league club that didn't have the financial wherewithal or the business nous to be able to have enough money to replace their own clubhouse, they just waited. So they just waited until council could do it or the state could do it. Now, look, it was convenient that the then Minister for Sport was the local member for this club. And so there was obviously some political points scored here. But just down the road from that football club is my house. It'll be, it's 8 years ago right now. It's 8 years ago this week that we moved home after doing a massive reno to our house. Now, at no point, Steve, did I wait for council to come and drop money in my lap to do a reno. At no point did I sit around bitching and moaning about how people can't pay or how we don't have enough money and then just waiting for somebody else to come and give me money to do a renovation to my house because the house didn't meet our needs. Nope. It was all, I was accountable for everything from start to finish. So somebody's going to have to go to the bank and see if Mr. Bank's going to give me some money to do this reno. Thank you very much. All my job. And then somebody has to pay that money back. Yep, all my job. In business, we do the same thing. When businesses want to grow, they need sometimes capital investments. So they will seek investments or they will seek venture capitalists or they will go to the bank and apply for loans. And they take it upon themselves because they are accountable. Can you see where I'm going with this? At home, we're smart. We know that we are accountable. It's our money. Okay, let's do it. If we need it, let's do it. Let's make it happen. Let's borrow. Let's work hard. Let's be smart. Great. That's how we do it. Anyone got a mortgage? Yes, you're doing it. Well done, you. And then in business, same thing. And then we get to our clubs and we forget all of that. So if you want stuff to happen, don't focus on how you can't make it happen. What can you do to make this happen? And then be accountable for that decision and then make it happen. It will take some time. But even if it takes a generation, which in a club might be as little as 4 years, once kids come in and go out for junior clubs. But let's say it's 10 years. How much better off is that club going to be because of your stewardship? Because when you were there, you took the bull by the horns and said, we are accountable. Let's actually make a crack of this. Let's make this happen without waiting for somebody else to come and dump everything in our lap.
I think there's a few underlying issues here.
Just a few?
Just a few. Firstly, volunteers find it, in my experience, really hard to think beyond that generation of involvement, whatever it be. And I think, roughly speaking, you're right. In the order of 4 years is about how long the majority of volunteers that get in and do a lot of the work are involved. Some are there for 20, 30 or, more years if they're rusted on.
Some good, some not so good.
Some, exactly. Some come and go very quickly, but most are there for a few years. And it's really hard. even in my own experience, when we've worked with volunteers to pull together a strategic planning document, it's hard to get people to think, what might this club look like in 20 or 30 years' time, other than the high level motherhood type statements. We're family friendly, we're accessible, we're inclusive,
And often people say, "Oh, I don't care, I won't be here then. My kids will be grown up by then."
or they come straight out and say that.
Yeah.
But
And be honest with yourself. If that's the case, maybe find a better job, because don't not be there. But if you are really focused on delivering great services to members, maybe in this case predominantly your kids, then maybe committee's not the best job for you. Maybe you're a far better team manager, for instance. Maybe you're a far better grounds manager because you're keen to give now. But in terms of looking into the future and having that good strategic oversight and real business sense, it makes sense for the right people to be doing that thinking.
Yeah, which, as we've discussed on many occasions, is or should be the focus of a management committee or board, is that strategic, longer term, where are we taking the club? How are we going to leave this organization better for us, having been involved, better for the long term? One of the other things that came to mind as you were talking is that often volunteers are distracted by what's urgent, and organizing jerseys and having referees for match day and
getting the portaloos sorted, making sure we've got enough beer in the cold room.
Exactly. All those things that people will really notice today, if they're not done, often distract management committees from thinking about the strategic things, the longer term future financial viability of the club. And what I was also thinking as you were talking, this example has come up time and time again, but I've heard even amongst committees comments like, "Oh yeah, look, the lights are shit, and our local league has told us that we're not going to get home games, night home games anymore unless we upgrade the lights. But we're planning to just let them get so bad that council can't ignore them, and then they have to replace them."
Well, it's funny you say that, because that field lights are certainly not the only time that happens, and it might not be council in that case. It might be we're waiting long enough so that the LED technology gets good enough so we can actually say that it's an upgrade, not just replacement of assets that we have failed to maintain, even though it clearly says that we've got to do that in our lease, and in our conditions of affiliation to our league.
Yeah.
So it's the other time that happens is when, for instance, in a leafy suburb where in the lease it clearly says once whatever the frequency is, you need to organise somebody to come and clean the leaves out of the gutter and off the roof. Because if you don't, then the gutters don't work. They hold water instead of draining water away. When they hold water, then the water backs up. So if you think about it, you've got the little cup of the drain sitting on the edge. If you think about a cross section, then you've got the roof running up at an angle. If you've got leaves sitting there, they hold water, and it can actually trap water and hold water on the roof. So it actually sits there as a puddle on a roof that's supposed to drain quickly away. When that happens, particularly when it's in the shade and it won't evaporate in the sun, it holds the water onto the roof. Roof is made of metal, screws are made of metal, screws start to rust because the water actually sits in, the seals break down around the little screws, then it actually sits there. Then the water leaks into the clubhouse, the roof rusts more, the ceiling then gets wet, the ceiling then drops, and where does it fall? Oh, I don't know, maybe onto the chip fry, maybe onto all of our expensive equipment in the canteen. Then we have these massive insurance claims time after time after time, just because we didn't clean the gutters. But then when it gets bad enough, and again, we get some people on the front page of the paper to stand there with sad, dejected looks on their faces, and council comes to the rescue. So this question was actually put to me by a council officer. What day is it? Monday today? Wednesday of last week. And the lovely bloke, excellent question. And I didn't give him the answer he wanted. He said, "Michael, how do we deal with it when clubs do exactly what you just said, Steve, when they just wait and they just wait? Because they know that if they let it get bad enough, we have to come and fix it." And I said, "Well, unfortunately, the political answer is that's just your lot, and you're going to have to deal with that, because that's the way that the political organisations, unfortunately, in cases like this, are too inclined to work." I said, until council can actually apply some consequences for action or inaction, nothing will change. So there's two approaches, colloquially called the carrot and the stick. The carrot is, if you do this, then we will allow you to have continued access. If you do this, then we will make sure that you're eligible for our grants, or you will be eligible for our grant programs. If you fail to do this, then we won't.
The opposite might be true.
Yes, yes. No, the opposite will be true. And that's the thing. All too often we see may be ineligible, may not be approved for renewal of your lease. We actually need to create some precedents here. And until that happens, until, pardon the expression, until some councillors grow some balls and make shit actually happen and hold people to account, then things won't change. Because it's all to, and riding the gravy train. Let's jump up north now to one of the councils up there, where there's a clubhouse building. Well, it's been repaired now, but after only 7 years, and we've talked about this one before, only 7 years old, it was riddled with termites because of just stupid and poor maintenance in this building. Now, council in that place didn't want to act because politically they thought, well, it's dangerous. If we piss off a club, then that represents, if that's a club of 300 or 400 people, that could be as many as maybe even 1,000 voters. And that's material. That's a material number when it comes to an election swing. So I don't want to piss off potentially 1,000 voters, not actually realizing that if we keep those 1,000 voters happy, what about the other 12,000 voters in the same area who say, well, hang on a minute, I don't even like that club. And the fact that you're giving my rates money to them because they're not doing their job that's actually written in their tenure agreement, hang on a minute. And it only takes those 12,000 to stand up and apply some of these sorts of consequences onto council before they'll say, actually, we need to change here. And unfortunately, it's political. So there's maybe some lobbying here that should happen.
Michael, surely you're not suggesting that councillors make decisions based on what's in the best interest of them getting re-elected rather than what's in the best interest of their constituents.
Ah, self-interest, the most powerful force in the universe. Well, it's interesting because it's not only sporting organisations that we're talking about here. There are arts organisations, art galleries, there are musical organisations that suffer from exactly the same thing. Now, again, musical organisations, for instance, can be fee for service, and we are cultural as well as sporting, maybe a little more sporting, depending on the circles in which one moves. We could be a little more sporting than we are cultural. But the same sort of thing exists for those sorts of organisations as well. It does get tricky then when we get to things like libraries, because councils have it's a written or unwritten rule or expectation of community service obligations. And so in areas like libraries, and for state and federal governments like healthcare and education, public education and road networks, there's an expectation that we're going to contribute there. But where there is an opportunity for organizations to take their own destiny into their own hands and make themselves sustainable, then why wouldn't you? Now, this is why it's important to ride the gravy train when it exists. Okay, acknowledge it. And if you're not getting a deal that others are, and this is where the political lobbying comes into it. There was a rugby club in this council I was talking about up north with the termites. There was a rugby club there, or lots of rugby clubs, but just one in particular that was doing a really good job. They were always on time. They weren't a tenant. They were just a hirer of the facility, and they didn't bitch and moan. So they were paying thousands of dollars every day to have this facility watered, mowed, line marked, just turn up, play and go home, put the pads on, the goalpost pads on, and then go home. And somebody else was serving. So it was just pay. And then they had a fee model that reflected that. Now, in exactly the same council, there was a golf club that was being funded to the tune of $200,000 a year for water and electricity to run the pumps to pump that water. And the rugby club was getting nothing. Now, if I was that rugby club, and I would, of course, know this because this is a sort of looking that anyone can do. You'd find out what everyone else is getting. Are we all on an even wicket here, or are some of us getting more than some of us pigs more equal than others and getting more than our fair share? Then I would say to council, you're funding this golf club $200,000 a year. By the way, they have 10 members.
Oh my God.
They did at the time. This is 2017, 18. They had 10 members. So we've got,
It's a pretty good per golfer subsidy,
yeah.
right?
So we've got a couple of things here, council. You can either pay us $200,000 to run rugby, or you can pay us $20,000 per member. You can contribute $20,000 per member on our membership base. So it seems absurd when that happens. And again, all it's going to take is for somebody to do that. And why not? Now, you might not want to get offside politically, and I perfectly appreciate that, because although I'm speaking very black and white, just do it, just do it, just do it. Realistically, there's also the court of public opinion to which one has to appeal. So play it sensitively. But if you recognize that you're on a good wicket, and I pretty much guarantee that every sporting organization that we've ever worked with is on a good wicket one way or another, acknowledge how it's a good wicket, and then look at what life would be like if you didn't have that. If you didn't have that gravy train to ride, and then set a business model and fee structure around that real reality, just in case a gravy train pulls into the station and you got to get off, because then you will be sustainable. You will be one of the winners. We saw some of this sort of behavior at the start of COVID last year, when there was, again, more bitching and moaning in the newspaper. Oh, the restrictions are stopping us and we're going to go broke. Yet some clubs just went, what can we do? Remember, we talked about this at the time. What can we do? What can we do? And they did it.
And now they're the ones kicking goals.
Pardon the pun. I'm working with a club that has had a 40% increase in membership on 2019. So 2019 to 2020, it's 30% up in 21 than it was in 2020, but it increased.
Wow.
So it's still increased. So they are just doing good business. There's nothing complicated here. Everyone knows the rules. Everyone was pissed off that we had to have groups of 10 and we had to enter this way and had to hand sanitize and scan QR codes. But they did it, and they played football, and they love it. And now they're back, and they're staying. Now they're welded on because they've been through tough times with this club. What can we do? So the takeaway from all of this is to have a look at your financials, have a look where money's coming in from, and have a look where money's going out to, and then consider what it would be like if you had to be hiring that space at a realistically commercial rate. So just imagine you're not a not-for-profit organization with an unrealistic fee structure and an unrealistic business model, and work out what it would look like if it was real. And then see if you can take a journey to get there, with not doing it in one single step, because that'll be a bit of a faux pas and people will get pissed off, and rightly so, but with definitely telegraphing your punch, letting your members know what's coming, to say, this is what's going on here. And you've got to properly value that within yourselves first. So recognize that what we've got in sport is intrinsically valuable, and people are prepared to pay for it. Sport is cool. And I often talk about a continuum where at one end of the continuum, we have the cool stuff, which is sport, dance, violin lessons, music. And then, and of course, we want all of that. And so we've got great not-for-profit organizations that either run or support those pursuits. Down the other end of the spectrum, still not-for-profit organizations, still community service obligations. We've got places like domestic violence shelters for women. We've got mental health services in Indigenous communities. Wouldn't it be great if we didn't need those services? There's nothing cool about needing those services, but we bloody need them. So we've got to build business models around both sorts, recognizing that at the cool end of the spectrum, it's pretty easy to say, hey, we got a pretty easy user pays market here. Then to the other end of the spectrum, we can recognize, well, this is not going to be user pays. So that is where we should be investing our rate money or our tax money there, because we want to provide them and we want to provide the best service we can. But if it's cool and people are prepared to pay, then let's build a business model around that.
I really like the analogy that one of the sport and rec advisors here in Queensland used, which is, sport is not a charity. And there's actually more to that than just the words that you hear at the outset. And that is that delivering, primarily being a sport organization, so a not-for-profit that delivers sport, means that you're not eligible for charitable status. You can't become a deductible gift recipient if your primary focus is sport. So that alone aligns beautifully with what you were just saying, which is that we really need to value our offering. And I think that there's a gross undervaluing that happens in sport in Australia, and that's largely because of the conditioning and the fact that people, for however long they've been playing, delivering, volunteering in whatever, their chosen sport or sports, they have seen it delivered too cheaply, and they therefore come to expect that that's how it should continue to be provided into the future. And as you pointed out last week, you know, when clubs realize what they actually place a realistic value rather on what it is that they have to offer, often there's no pushback. And they don't lose members, and they don't lose facility hirers. They don't lose customers because they've reviewed their pricing, especially if, as you say, they educate the members, customers, and so on before the change takes place. People understand why that increase in fees or, hike in higher rates for playing fields is necessary to ensure the long-term financial viability of the organization. And in our experience, that education before the rollout of the decision is vital. And even, at state and possibly at national sporting level, there are great examples of significant, overhauls of financial fee structures. So one of the sports that we've worked in for many, many years at the state level used a very simple budget calculator that we can happily share with any listeners to demonstrate the need for an increase in their fees. And, initially the board kind of pushed back and said, no, we won't possibly get that agreed to. But as soon as they put the figures into a really easy to digest fee calculator that paints a pretty clear picture in a pie chart that shows where all of that money is going to go, everyone agreed. They said, oh yeah, gosh, if it's as simple as, not maybe black and white in that case, but blue, green, pink, purple, all of the colors of the pie chart.
There's the internal value that you apply to things as well. So that's a great story. And I remember Julie's face when I said, is this sport expensive or cheap? And director of finance at the state association, she said, oh, it's so expensive. And then you've got all the equipment and then the travel. And we had a little discussion around it. And just to watch her body language from being slumped in her chair and dejected about how expensive our sport was to then realizing how much of a good wicket they were on, the sport in general, and therefore the state association, and to watch her sit up in her chair and then to have the tool, as you say, to be able to run the numbers and say, well, it's actually affordable to move us from a pathway that is leading us to questionable sustainability to one that took them to a point of viability and then opportunities for real meaningful growth over time.
Yeah.
So to bring this all home, Steve, there are a couple of things that I really just want to hammer on about. No, I'm not going to hammer on about them. I want to hammer into our listeners. just do this stuff. Number one, run a good business. Run a good business. Just imagine what you would change if you were CEO and you were swept in to find all of the crap wrong with this business and fix it. Because, sometimes you see those changes when, particularly in high profile CEO roles in the corporate world, they sweep in and they just make, and the changes, people don't like them, especially people within those organizations. When you talk to them and they say, the bloody CEO's got no idea of what's going on. The CEO is seeing things from a global perspective. How can you see things from a global perspective? So maybe the whinging and moaning that you're doing is protecting some old tradition or some person. You don't want to tread on somebody's toes. We were talking last week about a committee, for instance, where, people want to say, yes, this is a great idea. So there's 5 on the committee. Yes, a great idea. Yes, great idea. Yes, great idea. Yes, great idea. But Harry says, oh, I'm not so sure. And you know what happens? We end up living in a Harryocracy, and Harry gets to have the final say because nobody wants to piss off old Harry. Hang on a minute, that's not a democracy, is it? So be able to stand up to those old traditions or old silly decisions and see them for what they are. Think about what you did at work or what you did when you wanted to buy a home or build a home or renovate a home, when you took it upon yourself to make those changes, and be accountable. Run a good business, be accountable. Then when we get a little more specific, have a sinking fund. When you're running a great business and you can actually be putting money away for a rainy day or for asset replacement when assets reach the end of their useful life, you have a great business. But guess what? It's not going to be the sinking fund that is the thing that people connect to. Because seriously, who connects to a sinking fund? Talk about sterile. But if you have a business that is good enough to be able to be contributing on a regular and systematic basis money into a sinking fund, what else are you going to be able to do? You will be the sort of organization that has genuine sustainability and can genuinely give, because you will be the sort of organization that has enough resources, enough money, enough people, enough love, enough commitment, enough connection, welded on, rusted on, raving fan members, that when you identify somebody or a family or a group of somebodies who have the desire to participate, but they don't have the financial means to participate, then you're the sort of organization that will have something like a scholarship fund to be able to help these people who realistically aren't able to participate. You will be the sort of organization that can genuinely give them a hand up, not a hand out. You will be giving them a hand up. And that is, this is why we do this, because we see these sorts of things happening in remote communities in Northwest Queensland or in the Northern Territory. And you go, my God, these guys are just so wonderful. But they've built a business model around it so that they've actually got the bus that goes into the communities and picks up kids from school, brings them to the AFL club in the afternoon. Before they run out onto the field, they have afternoon tea. Then they go on the field, they do an hour and a half of training. Then they come back in, they do some stretching, then they do homework. Then they go out, they do some, have a bit of bite to eat, they go out and do some more training. Then they come in, they have dinner, and then they take the kids home. That is meaningful. And can government do that? Well, yeah, but not on a one-on-one basis like that.
No.
And it's a sort of program that you see. We've seen some really fantastic government programs run in sport. And what happens is those programs are successful. They deliver tremendous results. And then government says, oh, well, that was good. Now we've got these failing programs over here. Let's divert the money that was working over there to these ones that aren't working. And they throw good money after bad. They literally can good. You don't have to can. When you are the master of your own destiny because you're running a great business and you have a sinking fund, and then you're running the sort of business that can have a sinking fund, then you've got all of these other things going. And here I am, fire and brimstone on my pulpit again.
And also able to replace your own assets at the time when that replacement is actually required, not when they're beyond their useful life and opposing, let's face it, in some cases, a serious safety risk to participants.
Or when they reach their useful life, the end of their useful life too early because you haven't done the maintenance.
Yes. Yep. So I love sitting in meetings with clubs and say, oh yeah, we've got this to do and this to do and this to do. Now we've only got $350,000 in the bank. So we want to maximize, the value that we get from that money. Oh God, only $350,000 in the bank. And exactly, leverage that and get the grants where you can, because there are projects which will continue into the future to be attractive to
another gravy train. Get on board.
Absolutely. If the money's there, bloody well tap into it.
Yep. So the final point for me then is on asset maintenance is use a tool. Like, don't be a tool, use a tool. So as a lot of our listeners already know, we've developed a tool called Asset Track, ASSETTRAC.com.au, which actually helps clubs manage assets and manage their maintenance of those assets. And we developed the program in 2017 to 2018 to 2019, following work that we were doing with the government on facility management. And we just wanted a tool that did a lot of the work for clubs, that was developed specifically for clubs, that said, well, these are the sorts of assets that clubs are going to have. This is the sort of work that's going to need to be done. And rather than just giving a blank template, here's a tool that does it for you. The pricing is deliberately set so that it is attractive for the cost-sensitive, not-for-profit, particularly sport and recreation world, but certainly for all not-for-profit groups. And it guides you through the process. That's a full life cycle asset register plus programmed maintenance, and does all of the remembering and all of the reminding for you. And then when you transition committees, it's just, there's the one password. And remember that an asset register is not the depreciation schedule in the back of your annual financial statements, because how many assets are on there that you don't own anymore? And how many assets do you own that nobody ever bothered putting onto the depreciation schedule?
Having said that, the depreciation schedule is a really good
guide for how much we should be putting into our sinking fund.
That's right. And so often I hear treasurers or committees say, oh, we only made a profit of X dollars this year, or we made a loss, but that's including depreciation of $20,000. Well, sure, it's a non-cash expense and therefore you may have finished the year with more cash in the bank than
It says in
you
profit.
started the year. Yep. But if you don't put that money aside, those assets are still depreciating. Still going to need to be replaced or have serious money pumped into them. So bloody well put money aside. That's your accountant knows that you are income tax exempt. The accountant knows that you get no value from decreasing your taxable income by a non-cash deduction. So bloody well put that money aside, or at least work towards putting some money aside.
Yep. Run a good business, do your maintenance, have a sinking fund, run the sort of business that if it has a sinking fund, then has the ability to provide meaningful impacts to communities. Maintain your assets, use tools. Obviously, Asset Track is the one that's designed specifically for our sector. And finally, I'd just like to point to the budget planner that you talked to, Steve. I've pulled up to make sure I get the web address right. cprgroup.com.au/financial-management. And there's one there for sports and one there for other not-for-profit groups that helps do exactly what Steve said, providing that pie chart that says this is how we can sell this, but also tells you where once you divide your activity related income from your ancillary income, and the same with expenditure, what the actual income or what the actual profit or loss from your activities are. So then you can see how much you're subsidizing, for how much participation cost you're subsidizing by running the canteen or by selling raffle tickets and putting extra burden on the same 10 people, the small number of volunteers who are already busy doing everything else. Steve, this has been a little fun time, a bit of
rant fest.
Yeah, jump up onto my soapbox again. So thank you to our listeners for indulging us to do that for the last half hour or so. As always, Steve, it's a good chance to remind our listeners to keep the good ideas for podcast episodes coming. And in fact, there's we've had some really good feedback recently. One of them was from a girl on a committee who said, "This is just fantastic. All I do is listen to your podcasts, and then I go to our committee meetings and I say, listen to the podcast." And she says, "You guys do all the heavy lifting for me." And we come back next month and they go, "Yeah, that was right. Let's do that." And they're applying this stuff. So it's just so wonderful to hear when that happens. So of course, please keep the good stories coming. If you're not already following us on social media, you can. CPR Group is our name, and you can sign up for our newsletter at cprgroup.com.au and find old episodes of podcasts and some great articles on there as well. And of course, if you want to drop us a line, info@cprgroup.com.au, and we're very happy to listen to anything about basket case clubs becoming showcase clubs.
Almost did it. You almost basket case clubs.
Basket case club. Oh, that reminds me of episode 1. But yes, it is still obviously fun to bitch and moan about basket case clubs, but always with a reason. So yeah, take the ideas and apply them. And of course, have fun with this stuff. Life on a committee, life in a club should be fun. So enjoy it. Steve, thanks again. Lovely to talk to you about another basket casey topic.
As always, thank you for the opportunity, and I look forward to catching you next time.
See you then. Bye. Good stuff.